Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing a design to reduce inalienable rights under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. From the Declaration of Independence of the United States, July the 4th, 1776. One of the great achievements of Western civilization is the Constitution of the United States of America. It arose during the period of human enlightenment that happened in the 18th century right across the civilization covered by what we now think of as Christendom, plus the Americas. The Enlightenment has been called into question by many of late, and even blamed for many of the ills we face today. I addressed this question elsewhere, mainly in the video Civilization, New Enlightenment, but for the moment, let's take for granted that the positive reputation of the Enlightenment is mostly due. I will just note that criticisms of the Enlightenment usually revolve around the idea that it overstated rationalism as a way of understanding the world and shaping the world and civilization. My overall view of the Enlightenment will challenge this idea. The US Constitution was developed through a highly sophisticated debate among the group of individuals that we now call the founders, but they were able to draw from previous Republican constitutions and writings on constitution and law. As regards constitutions, they drew most notably on the Constitution of the Roman Republic of Antiquity and the unwritten constitutional arrangements in England that were formulated following the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England. Whilst the English unwritten constitution was not republican, as it retained a monarchy as head of state, it had many republican features, and it still has these. As regards books, they were most heavily dependent on the Englishman John Locke's two treatises on government and the Frenchman Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. The latter was itself very highly influenced by the British constitutional arrangements and frequently cited these as a model. One of the great innovations of the US Constitution was the creation of a federation of states, all with substantial independent power and with their own constitutions, but nevertheless unified under the overall national federation. Previous republics had either been city-states like Venice or highly centralized unitary states like the Roman Republic, or, for that matter, the short-lived English Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Many said that a republic the size of the then United States of America was impossible. The founders proved them wrong. All subsequent Republican constitutions have been based, to a greater or lesser extent, on the example of the American Constitution. This includes the modern constitutions of France, Germany, Italy, and Russia, for example. All of these, except France, are federations, the designs of which look to the US Federation. This includes the modern constitutions of France, Germany, Italy, and Russia, for example. All of these, except France, are federations, the designs of which looked to the US Federation. The US Constitution is thus held in awe, both in theory and in practice. But as we look at the state of the USA today, with its illegitimate president, its dictatorial style, its widespread rank corruption, not only in government, but also extending to the judiciary and its corporate power that has overtaken, in many respects, the supposed democracy, it is clear that this revered document has failed. This failure of the US Constitution has been a fact of American political life almost from the beginning, but its weakness has with time become more and more apparent. The failure of the US Constitution has been a fact of American political life almost from the beginning, but its weakness has with time become more and more apparent. The state of the USA today, in spite of the existence of many Americans of goodwill and wisdom, is a grotesque caricature of the country envisaged by the founders. America is far from being alone in having a failed constitution, but I am focusing on the USA for the moment because of its primacy in making of modern constitutions. Americans rightly hang on to their faith in the Constitution, and frankly this is due in great measure to the fact that they have nothing else. And it is correct that they should believe in the Constitution, for the Constitution is the cornerstone of a true republic. Officers of state in the US, including the military, swear allegiance to the Constitution and nothing else, and vow to uphold it against attacks by foes, domestic and foreign. But to repeat, the US Constitution has failed the nation it is supposed to serve. Now, there is an important objection that can be raised to the above account. It can be argued that a country's constitution is one thing, but a constitution is nothing more than the context within which the politicians operate, and so if they are not up to the job, you cannot blame the Constitution. As founder Benjamin Franklin said, "We give you a republic if you can keep it." That is to say, if things don't work out, don't blame us. After all, a constitution is just a piece of paper, and it is people's actions that count. In other words, the constitution and political life are separate things, and both need to be adequate if a country is to be properly run and become a success for all its citizens. We need not only a good constitution, but also virtuous enactors of the provisions of that constitution to create a good society. Politically, I am a constitutionalist. That is to say, I believe that only the Constitution can be used instrumentally to fix certain problems, or rather, prevent them from occurring in the first place. That is to say, we cannot rely on legislators to correct many types of problems, for they can fall victim to corruption if the Constitution is not properly designed to explicitly prevent this. This point cannot be overstated. Ultimately, it is not so much bad policy that undermines a country, but corruption. And corruption occurs primarily because the Constitution does not embody the necessary safeguards to prevent it. This is central to our fight against globalism, as it is through corruption and the parasites it breeds that the globalists enter the body politic. As I will describe, we need a radical overhaul of our ideas as to how to design the nation's constitution. We cannot just copy or modify the US Constitution, for it and all the constitutions in the world that are based on it are similarly flawed. We need a written constitution in Britain, and it must be based on this radical new view of constitutions to be successful in making a prosperous and just society and in resisting the globalist reach. As I detail elsewhere, it is the parasites within a nation that are the handmaidens of the globalists, but only the fundamentals of the Constitution can eliminate parasitic activity. We cannot legislate ourselves out of this problem, for legislation can be too easily reversed to perform this essential role. We cannot let Parliament kick fundamental constitutional principles back and forth as political footballs. I will now illustrate my point that only the Constitution can be used instrumentally to prevent many types of malfeasance, with a particular constitutional component we must implement to put a stop to parasitism and the corruption of our political life. It is this: there must be an iron wall between government and certain types of companies. These companies are principally financial companies and multinationals, although as we get into the details, we may want to include others, such as those of the arms manufacturing industry or pharmaceutical giants. The iron wall is created as follows. Firstly, once someone has entered into government service, they can never, ever accept any money, favour, employment or contract of any kind from a finance company or a multinational. Crucially, this applies not only for their term of office, but for the rest of their lives. This includes both elected representatives and members of the civil service, at least those working at relatively high levels. For our purposes, the military is included in the civil service. We cannot allow the notorious revolving door between ex-politicians and ex-public servants and the stated types of companies to continue. It is as plain as the noses on all our faces that this is a recipe for corruption. That corruption is bad enough in itself, but it is also the means by which the globalist parasites insert themselves into our nation. Penalties for violation will be of the utmost severity and will include prison and loss of all pension rights at a minimum. The second aspect of the iron wall is the same as the first, but in reverse. Once someone has taken a position in a finance company or a multinational, they can never, ever become an elected politician or a high-ranking civil servant. And the bar for high ranking here should be taken as being fairly low. No one is implying that there's anything wrong with working for such companies. We need them, given certain provisos. No one is implying that such companies do not have a legitimate role to play in the national life and that government should not talk with them and address their concerns. The government cannot live in a shoebox. The aim can never be to stymie a full dialogue between all interests and to turn companies into certain types of pariahs. The iron wall means that when people start their careers in government or the companies mentioned, they have to think very carefully, as there will be no going back. Let us be clear, this rule does not include companies that are exclusively national in their production, infrastructure, ownership, employment and tax declarations. Of course, this list does not include their markets. Their markets can be international. We welcome, with provisos, exports. The last thing we want is for government to not benefit at first hand from the experience of good national entrepreneurs. Both industry and government are always best when they work hand in hand. Good business persons can make good members of parliament and have special experience and skills to bring to the political debate. But financial companies and multinationals must be set apart, as it is clear from the way that the parasites and their globalist friends exercise their activities. These companies can be very easily put to service of them. And so these must occupy a special position in our constitutional arrangements that strictly national-based companies, for the most part, do not share. The iron wall principle is stated here simply as an illustration of how it is that only the Constitution can instrumentally deal with certain problems we face. But the whole new Constitution will include more, much more. In order to fully comprehend the major faults with existing republican constitutions, we must first look at the principles upon which they were historically founded, for these principles themselves were ill thought out. Again, I am concentrating on the US Constitution, not because it is necessarily any worse than any others, but because of its foundational, revered status. A major concern of Republican constitutions and Republican theorists and writers throughout the history of republicanism has been the accumulation of too much power in one or two few offices of state or empire, usually the executive or head of state. Such accumulation resulted in what used to be called tyranny, or what today we would call dictatorship. Republican constitutions have sought to devise ways of avoiding this. The traditional solution to this problem has been twofold. One, to divide up the function of government into different offices and have each office held by a different group or different person. Two, to make tenure of each office temporary according to a set down timescale or term. Reselection may be according to a democratic vote, a vote by an electoral college, or by appointment. Yes, that last phrase was by appointment, for we are not only considering democratic institutions here. The basic offices usually are identified as threefold. 1. Executive or head of state, which performs the day-to-day decisions on running of the state and its apparatus, including the military. Such decisions may or may not be subject to approval by the legislature. 2. The legislature, which performs the framing and passing of laws. In a bicameral system, the legislature consists of two houses, an upper house, the Senate or House of Lords, and a lower one, the House of Representatives or the Commons. 3. Judiciary, which administers the law. In addition, the US founders introduced a further great office of state, for they understood that there needs to be a higher authority to defend the Constitution. This is known as 4. The Constitutional Court or Supreme Court. The first two, executive and legislature, are part of government, usually the democratic as opposed to bureaucratic part. The last two, including the Constitution or Supreme Court, are the judiciary. As a side note, in the UK, the function of the Constitutional or Supreme Court used to be exercised by the upper chamber of Parliament, the House of Lords, albeit by a special group within it, known as the Law Lords, and so it came within Parliament, the legislature. This anomaly was corrected with the creation of the UK Supreme Court, separate from Parliament and part of the judiciary in 2009. This was the brainchild of Tony Blair, even though he had left the offices of Prime Minister. And incidentally, it was one of the just two good things Blair did as Prime Minister, the other being the Freedom of Information legislation. Yes, that is right, the words good and Blair did appear in the same sentence. This identification of the powers of society as residing only in the 4 offices of executive, legislature, judiciary, and Supreme Court is far too narrow, and this is absolutely fundamental to understanding why modern republican constitutions fail, allowing corruption and parasitism to run wild. The principal offices of state, all separated from each other constitutionally, originates from Montesquieu's spirit of the laws, and his ideas in turn were heavily based in the British unwritten constitution as he saw it. He saw in Britain the separate offices of the monarchy, parliament and the judiciary, that is executive, legislature and judiciary, and was impressed with this as a model. Its parallels with the revered ancient Roman republican constitution, with its separation between the consuls, executive, senate and tribunes, legislation, and judiciary, was obvious. The separation of the monarchy from the parliament in England had been formalised under the Whig Party in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, following a period of great difficulty with the Stuart monarchs of the 17th century. The Stuart kings sought to impose their will on Parliament in a way the Whigs could not accept. This trait of the Stuarts resulted in the English Civil War and in the execution of the king Charles I. But following the restoration of 1660, although the power of the monarch had been weakened, the Stuarts had not learned their lesson and continued their overbearing attempts to control Parliament, not to mention religion and some fundamental freedoms as well. The Whig Party became the party of revolution to drastically reduce the power of the monarch, and many prominent Whigs were martyred to this cause. They finally got rid of the last Stuart, James II, in 1688 and put the Dutchman Protestant William of Orange on the throne and firmly limited its powers with a document they called the Bill of Rights. The power of the monarch was limited by a separation between the monarch and Parliament. This was made conspicuous and theatrical by preventing access to the monarch to the parliamentary buildings, that is to say the Palace of Westminster, except by Parliament's express permission. When the monarch is required to be present in Parliament, this has to follow an elaborate, almost comical entry ceremony which is still enacted today. Thus, the separation between executive and legislature was created and made explicit, lest anyone, especially the monarch, should be in any doubt. The independence of the judiciary had always been established going back to the Magna Carta, although we might mention that the Stuarts had set their own personally controlled judicial system, which was the notorious Star Chamber. This woeful precedent created another reason for keeping the monarch under tight control. This British system of separation of the powers of executive, legislature and judiciary impressed Montesquieu. It was Montesquieu who expressed it formally for the first time in his influential book. But this system, as I will show, is flawed. It is not that it does not have merit, and there is nothing fundamental to it that should be jettisoned, but it is far from adequate as a basis for an effective modern constitution. And this fact is staring us all in the face when we look at the state of nations all over the world today. Most notably, it assumes everybody plays by the rules. In other words, parasites don't exist. Or to put that another way, it does not fully take into account human nature. The US constitutional model needs drastic extension, not to create more government, but to streamline government and enable it to address fully the monstrous, obscene ills that society faces. This cannot be done by a shopping list of legislative proposals such as a party manifesto might contain. We need a new constitution. How we actually install a new constitution is a big subject in itself, and the history of creating new constitutions and how that can occur I address elsewhere. Here I will concentrate on outlining in brief some of the essential provisions of the new constitution, leaving aside for the moment how these are to be put in place. I will deal with this from two perspectives. Firstly, I will take the grander view and show how we extend the scope of the Constitution. Secondly, I will go back to the details of the theory of the separation of powers between the offices of state and show how the US model fails. To understand how the scope of the Constitution must be extended, I will make use of my theory of political science. This is original to me, so you won't read it anywhere else, and for want of a better term, I call it Coloian political science. This I explain fully elsewhere under the title of Political Science, Architecture of the Four Estates. Here I will sketch it only in outline to give us a more useful view of the subject of this essay, which is the failure of modern constitutions. Current US-based constitutions, derived as they are from Montesquieu and the US founding fathers, identify only two of what I term estates. Now, I'm aware that the word estate already has a certain currency, but this is not a highly used one, or for that matter, a well understood one. People talk about the fifth estate to mean the press, for instance. In pre-revolutionary France, the term was also current. The way I will use the word estate conforms pretty exactly to the general sense it already has, but I will tighten up its meaning and use it to expand this political science. In these terms, the current constitutional models contain two of what I call estates. The executive and the legislature belong to the first estate, which can also be termed democracy. Members of the first estate, the democratic estate, are selected by democratic process, in other words, elections. We should understand that elections here usually means popular elections where the franchise is universal, the only exclusions being due to youth or maybe imprisonment or other exceptional circumstances. But elections are not by any means always popular. The use of the college system, for instance, is not popular election. College systems, as I explain elsewhere, are inherently republican, for republics expressly do not rely completely on pure democracy. Republicanism does not regard democracy as the apple pie of the popular imagination. For this reason, college systems are very familiar to people living in modern republics, but not so much to people living under a constitutional monarchy, such as the UK. So we have looked at the first estate. Let us now look at the second estate. It is not mentioned by Montesquieu and has no component, or virtually no component, in the US Constitution. But as we all easily recognize today, it is of paramount importance to the way our society is run. This applies particularly to our point of major concern here, which is that of the operation of parasites within society and the gateway they provide for stateless globalists to enter the body politic. The second estate is the financial estate. We may also call this the plutocracy. Its membership is made up primarily of banks, and here meaning banks in the strict sense of financial companies that enjoy a special status conferred by the central bank that enables them to indulge in fractional reserve lending. That is, that they can lend out more money than they actually have. For the record, in spite of this practice often creating a heated antagonism, it is, in principle, a legitimate and necessary activity in an open entrepreneurial society. I explain this in detail elsewhere. The second estate also includes non-bank financial companies, such as commercial lenders, insurance companies, investment banks, and hedge funds. The last of these, incidentally, engage exclusively in parasitic activities, which under the new constitution will be illegal. I describe this long list of activities in detail elsewhere. Hedge funds will cease to exist as their modus operandum is removed. The other estate that is included, at least in part, in current constitutions and in constitutional theory is the third estate, which can be termed the meritocracy. The judiciary belongs to this estate, but the meritocracy as a concept is much more than the judiciary. Entry to the meritocracy is by virtue of merit, formal qualification, or experience. The last estate, the fourth estate, comprises the civil service and public services, and here this is taken to include the military. We may also call this the bureaucracy. In English, we have a nice distinction between the civil service and the public services, which does not exist in France, for example, where they are all lumped together as fonctionnaires. The civil service was originally so called to distinguish it from the military service, but for our purposes, civil service, public services, and the military all belong to the fourth estate of the public services. Here again, we will note that neither Montesquieu nor the US Constitution is there any mention of public services. Well, that statement, as it happens, is not quite true, because the US founders, in a remarkably forward-thinking insight, determined that the state should provide a postal service and put this in the Constitution. This means, for one thing, that unlike in other countries, the postal service, mercifully, cannot be privatized. But apart from this singular exception, the US Constitution was written as if public services did not exist. This omission again can be traced back to Montesquieu. As with the omission of the second estate and most of the third, the neglect of the fourth estate contributes in a major way to the failure of the US Constitution and consequently all the constitutions that are influenced by it. Effectively, there is no prescription for how the public services should be constituted, and there is no prescription for how the civil service should be constituted. This last point is particularly important in the matter of the makeup of the cabinet under the executive, which I will consider in a moment. Thus, Coloian political science describes what we might call the architecture of the four estates. We need to understand how this architecture works, for to ignore it is to ignore the real nature of human society. A constitution that misunderstands human society and human motivation can never be adequate. In this, we should be clear that the architecture of the four estates is not something I dreamed up. I tested it over and over against historical examples. It is intrinsic and inevitable to all societies, and this even extends to the most primitive societies, although in the latter, the elements take on a different form. This is political science, not political philosophy, so the four estates will be there whether we recognize them or not, whether we want them or not. If we do not recognize them, we will design a very poor constitution, for the constitution works on a presumed model of society, and this model must be a good and accurate one. The principle of the estates refers to how power is exercised in society, and this power arises naturally, not through law or through the constitution. The purpose of the radical new constitution is not to eliminate and outlaw this power, but to harness it for the good of society at large. In any case, you cannot eliminate it because I say it is natural. It will always be there. The way to harness this power is to license its operation and confine it to certain groups. These are the estates. So, for instance, only banks, the second estate, have the right to issue money using fractional reserve. Only members of certain professional bodies, the third estate, can, for instance, practice medicine. Only members of the civil service, the fourth estate, can work directly for government. The fundamental principle by which the Constitution deals with the estates is by means of which, rather crudely, we might term a trade-off or a deal. Members of the estates are granted certain privileges, and in return they must operate in a certain way. Thereby, their power is harnessed for the common good. There is a bit more to it, as the proper constitution of the estates create a structure that favours the emergence of human virtue, and I explain this in more detail in my discussion of institutions. This brief overview of the estates is sufficient for our present purposes. Here it is simply necessary to understand that the failure of modern constitutions to address the power of the estates, which I repeat is going to be there whether we like it or not. This means there is a giant hole in these constitutions' sphere of application. To summarize, a modern constitution for a modern state must recognize more powers than the traditional executive, legislature, judiciary, and constitutional court, and provide a means for harnessing and restraining these powers. It must take account of what I call the architecture of the four estates. As I said earlier in this essay, I would deal with the failure of modern constitutions from two perspectives. Firstly, I would take the grander view and show how we extend the scope of the constitution. So this I have just completed. Secondly, I would go back to the details of the theory of the separation of powers between the offices of state and show how the US model fails. This I will now undertake. In doing this, we have to concentrate on what I call under colloquial political science the first estate, the democracy. The reason for this limitation is clear. The first estate, the functioning of the democracy, is practically the only one that the US Constitution and others recognize, or at least give primacy to. It would be nice to be able to say that in spite of this omission, the founders got this part correct, but this is not the case. To understand why, it will be instructive to compare the US democratic system with the British one. Although the American written constitution and the British unwritten one breathe a lot of the same air, in this respect they are different, even opposing. The British system of government is used as a model for others, just as the American one is, and it gives its name to this system, the Westminster system. Although the Westminster system, as it is enacted in the British Parliament today, has its faults, it does, I believe, have certain overriding virtues against the American system. In comparing the two systems and to evaluate them, let us remind ourselves that the US system wants to make use of the principle of separation of powers as described by Montesquieu. This it does, but it takes this principle to such an extreme that the system is fundamentally flawed, and this fact constantly manifests itself in the political life of America. In fact, it determines its character, and not in a good way. But in criticizing this exaggerated separation of powers, let us pause for a moment to remind ourselves that the founders were not unaware of the problem of too much separation. To address the problem, they included in the Constitution what are called checks and balances. They well understood that you cannot have different parts of government working in their own self-contained silos, never communicating with each other or attempting to coordinate policy and legislative initiatives. Here are a couple of examples of how these checks and balances work. The executive, the president, takes executive decisions, like building a border wall or going to war, but it is the House of Representatives that approves the funding. Well, pretty obviously, an initiative that is unfunded is not going anywhere, so Congress is balancing the president's ability to act independently. Congress does not decide what to do, but it puts a check on what the president can do, the principle of checks and balances. Although this particular example does not apply to Westminster, the general principle of checks and balances does come from the British system. The selection of Supreme Court justices provides another American example. As I said, the Supreme Court comes under the judiciary, which is part of what I call the third estate, but the judiciary does not select its members. This is done by the president, who is part of the democratic system, or first estate. So the power of the judiciary is checked by the power of the democracy. But further than this, the president's nominations have to be ratified by the Senate, and so the power of the executive is checked by that of the legislature. Incidentally, the UK Supreme Court is decided by the judiciary itself in what would have been called in the past smoke-filled rooms. Here, there is no check on the choice of justices by the democracy arm of government, and this fact has inevitably led to controversy. Not that the selection of US Supreme Court justices is not itself frequently controversial, but for the moment, let's just put this down to politics often being messy, and messiness is a price we have to pay sometimes to avoid tyranny. So it is not that the founders did not recognize their fundamental principle of separation of powers contained difficulties within it, but they still did allow, in my view, too much separation of power. This has led to a very unfortunate aspect of American politics, and this is the emphasis on bargaining. Normal compromise is an inevitable aspect of politics. People sometimes compromise strongly held views in order to achieve a measure of what they want as opposed to nothing at all. You could say life is like that in general. The point about compromise is that it is normally something that happens within a single body, like a committee or a cabinet. But US-style political bargaining is on a whole different level, and it derives directly from an excessive insistence on separation of powers. I cannot emphasize too strongly that this over-separation leads to a very unfortunate result. It limits and even blocks career paths for elected politicians. It is this that in turn has the malign effect of leading to bargains and deals, not compromise and accommodation, as being a primary feature of political life. It is one thing to compromise beliefs to achieve a committee decision. It is quite another to set them aside completely and maybe support something you oppose to make a deal. The latter is very much part of life on the Hill. Consider the situation of a member of the House of Representatives. Because of the strict separation of powers, there is very little chance that they will ever have a chance of passing into the executive and advancing their career. So as representatives, they have effectively reached the limit as far as their political career can go. When the president gets Congress to back him or her, this often involves horse trading of a very undignified type. This is because the member of Congress is not concerned about looking like a responsible national executive politician for the simple reason that that career path is not open to them. True, they can become members of a congressional committee and call the executive and others to account, but that is not the same thing as being on the inside of policy making. And although you can become vociferous and well known as a committee member, it still does not directly lead anywhere in respect of your career. Our representatives has no power over executive decisions directly, except for the aforementioned control of the purse strings. But what they do have is the ability to wheel and deal in policy matters. The most notorious example of this is in the so-called pork barrel politics. The representative, having reached the limit of their career in DC, inevitably refers back to the people who sent them there in their own state. So trading between the president and a member of Congress, where the member votes with the president in exchange for an initiative in their own constituency, usually involving a hefty price tag, becomes the order of the day. And so to serve the national interest, local interests have to be bought off. But there is no sincerity on the behalf of either the president or the representative in such a trade-off. This is not a good way to run politics. It discourages honesty and objectivity. The Westminster system does not separate the executive from the legislature in this way, for the members of the cabinet are drawn almost exclusively from sitting members of Parliament. Now think about this in terms of career paths for a British politician. In Britain, a typical career path will mean getting elected as an MP, and once you have got a foot on the ladder, the sky is theoretically at least the limit. You can be appointed a junior minister, then a cabinet minister, and so on, and may even have an eye at some point on the very highest office of state. Under the British Republic, there is no reason why we should not maintain this cabinet system under the new constitution, the only difference being that the head of state is directly elected by the people and then forms his or her cabinet from the legislative body. There would still be a separation of powers between executive and legislature, but individuals can naturally move between the two. This is vital to retain in the new constitution because it means that an ordinary MP thinking of his or her chances of advancing their career always thinks about the interests of the executive at the same time as that of the legislature. In other words, it means they will balance the national interest with the local one because they personally have a stake in both. Pork barrel type deals can and so still happen within the British system, and in one way you could say that kind of politics is democracy at work. This is just a good MP working for their constituents. But nevertheless, the involvement with the political life at Westminster puts a check on this. However, the enormous disadvantage of the British system as it stands is that it delivers far too much power to the Prime Minister, who is in effect the executive, the head of state, and it gives them too much control over Parliament. It is too easy for the Prime Minister to dominate Parliament. Because the effective head of state, the Prime Minister, emerges directly from Parliament, the party system rules all, depriving the people of a say in who shall be the leader of the country. The complete lack of separation of powers delivers too much power into the hands of the Prime Minister, making both MPs and voters feel powerless. The way in which this problem should be addressed is to abolish the monarch and make the Prime Minister a presidential office. That would mean that they would be independently elected. This means their constituency is in the people in general, and so they will be obligated to the people directly. Under the present arrangements, the Prime Minister is always, by convention, the leader of the biggest party in the Commons, and so they are first and foremost a party animal. This is not healthy. There are many other refinements that are needed in the British Constitution, but the main point I wish to make here is that this principle of separation of powers, which is held up as a God-given principle by some, is nothing of the kind. It is just one element of a wise constitution, and a wise constitution must take account of natural human instincts of the people who will work within it. A wise constitution has to try and channel the efforts of honest and good men and women for the best. Not an easy thing to pull off. But the observations here about the makeup of the cabinet address the real human problem of how a career can evolve to satisfy natural ambition. And this is crucial. If we disregard in our constitution normal human instincts for realizing self-worth, corruption will follow, and corruption always opens doors to those super-rich, stateless individuals who are parasitic on their nation, the globalists. Nations have to run a tight ship to keep them out. I have one more major criticism of the US Constitution, or rather its implementation, to consider here. This relates to my previous considerations within the first estate, the democracy, and also the fourth estate, the bureaucracy. It concerns the makeup of the Cabinet Office of the President and the extended bureaucracy that goes with it. As I mentioned, the British Cabinet is drawn almost exclusively from members of Parliament. At various times, attempts to include outsiders, as the rather laughable Government of All the Talents initiative in the last days of the last Labour government, but it never quite works out. A more successful attempt, if a more regrettable one, to draw in people from outside has been in the formulation of the so-called kitchen cabinets, whereby the Prime Minister of the day brings in specially selected individuals for advice. The mercurial Dominic Cummings character has been one such of late. But the formal cabinet sitting around the long oval table in number 10 is normally made up exclusively of members of Parliament, and this includes both Commons and Lords. This arrangement would be in violation of US procedures. No members of Congress can be a member of the presidential cabinet. This is the extreme separation of powers that the Constitution is founded on at work. As well as the damage it does to career paths of people going into politics, the US cabinet system opens the doors for corruption. This is not to deny that some fine people have sat in presidential cabinets, but a major problem is that principle of accountability is absent. The president can choose literally who he or she wants from any walk of life, regardless of experience or qualification. Electoral mandate does not enter into it because they cannot be members of the national elected bodies. This is not necessarily an advantage for the president, as we saw with President Trump. He did not come from the political classes or from the swamp, as he termed it, and so was at something of a loss in finding enough people he could trust to fill the cabinet posts. This problem dogged him throughout his period of office. Now imagine if he had operated in the British system. He would choose from elected representatives with known track records and, moreover, democratic accountability. Not perfect, as nothing is, but especially in politics, but certainly helpful to him. Often tenure of US cabinet positions is short, and ex-cabinet members will often try to cash in on their association with the president, and the whole thing becomes degrading for all concerned. So much for problems in the First Estate, but there is also a massive one concerning the Fourth Estate, the bureaucracy. Not only does an incoming president have to choose his or her cabinet, they also remake the civil service to a great extent with their own appointments. These can amount to thousands of new members of the civil service. As I explain elsewhere in more detail, the Fourth Estate works, like all the estates, by granting privilege to its members, and in return, the members have to behave in a certain way. That means essentially that they put their personal interests below general or national interests. The essential privilege that the Fourth Estate has in most countries, certainly in the UK, France and Germany, is continuity of position and good pension rights. As I write, the privilege of civil servants is constantly under attack, especially in Britain and France, as governments are under the sway of the globalists, and the globalists hate independent groups, like with rights and privileges. The principle of an independent Fourth Estate is hanging on by a thread for the present. The new constitution must restore it and formally define its obligations and privileges. We are still far from having a civil service almost entirely appointed by the executive, as in the US, although that is certainly a threat we face. The craziness of the American system is shown up by the interim period of more than 2 months between the president being elected and being inaugurated. They need all this time for making new appointments and giving notice to staff they don't want. And of course, unless an incumbent is being re-elected, for the interim period, the person holding the great office is a lame duck. How different it is in Britain, where following a general election account that usually lasts until the early hours following voting day, the new Prime Minister, if there is a change, emerges from number 10 early in the morning with full powers of the office. This efficient transfer of power is due to one fact: the continuity of the Fourth Estate, specifically that part of the civil service that directly serves the Prime Minister. The civil service leading up to the election has to plan for all contingency. Normally, it will have 2 separate plans, one for the continuing of the incumbent and one for the opposition getting in. To underline the point, this kind of abuse of democracy can occur because of too rigid a separation of the powers of government. Both the American and the French systems derive directly from the principle of too much and too rigid a separation of powers. The US Constitution takes a principle set out by an 18th century Frenchman to an extreme. The founders were too beguiled by this simplistic theory. Separation of powers is a necessary part of a modern constitution, but like all elements of the constitution, great judgment is necessary in giving each of them appropriate weight. I repeat, I have not singled out the US Constitution for discussion because it is particularly bad, but because it is so foundational to our thinking about constitutions. There are other criticisms I have of the US Constitution, such as the funding of political campaigns and the lack of consistency in voting protocols between the states, a disaster for a true federation. But I will set those aside for the moment and mention just one other great defect. But before this, I wish to note how the French Constitution also suffers from the problem of easy, unqualified entry into the cabinet. France suffers from the same problem, whereby it is too easy for the president to appoint people to the cabinet from virtually nowhere in a political sense, although most cabinet members do come from the political machine. A blatant example occurred with the case of Emmanuel Macron. His background was in banking, including the House of Rothschild, and he was parachuted by President Hollande into the position of Minister of Finance, although he had no experience of politics. The experience as finance minister gave him enough prominence to stand for president in 2017, and as we know, with massive support from the French globalist media, was elected. This presidential election of 2017 was the first time, yes, the first time he had ever stood for a political office of any kind. Surely this cannot be right. Of course it happened because the globalist parasites could pull the levers to make it happen. It is not a problem that anyone can stand for president. The problem is that he could present himself as a credible candidate because of his experience in government, and that he had gained this experience purely because of entry into the cabinet was too open. Thus, France also illustrates the problem of entry into the cabinet being in the gift of the country's leader. Returning to another fundamental problem with the US Constitution from which we can learn, let us refer to its Article 5. It must be difficult to change a constitution. It must always be more difficult to change the constitution than to enact legislation. Otherwise, there effectively is no constitution, and this is the case in the UK. But it must not be too difficult, for that means that the constitution can never correct errors it contains and can never move with the times. Article 5 of the American Constitution deals with amending the Constitution, and without going into detail, its provisions are far too onerous. Amendments indeed have been made, but not so much since the Union expanded greatly from its original states. Article 5 presents a brilliant catch-22. It should be changed, but you have to work within it to make that change. So the Constitution becomes frozen. So it is very difficult to see how, with the best will in the world, any of the faults I have described can be corrected. All subsequent constitutions to the American Constitution have recognized the problems of Article 5 and so allow for change. I have attempted in this video to give part of the explanation of why and how we are in the mess we find ourselves in, and how and why we face the gravest of dangers. The globalists are bearing down on us, and they can do so because we do not have constitutions that can protect us from them. It is central to the principles upon which this party is founded that we can only protect ourselves from the globalist onslaught and their evil plans by means of a robust constitution. This constitution must be national. Constitutions are national by their nature. They only apply to nations. This is why it is only through the nation that we can defy and defeat the globalists. Central to this is the understanding that it is the parasitic traitors working and living amongst us within our nation who represent and advance the globalist interests. Our constitutions are weak because they are not based on an adequate political science. I have indicated how the political science of Montesquieu, who is such a key figure in the formation of modern constitutions, is flawed. His political science is inadequate because he does not recognize how the four estates automatically operate in any society. The second estate, the plutocracy, and the fourth, the bureaucracy, he ignores. His references to the third estate, the meritocracy, is partial. He concentrates on the first estate, the democracy, but gets things wrong, mainly because he takes the principle of separations of power to an extreme. The founders of the US Constitution were so heavily influenced by Montesquieu that they embodied almost completely the faults in his thinking, as well as what is good. The faults of all present modern constitutions come down to their being based on an inadequate political science. They simply do not have a good model of how societies naturally operate to work with. A constitution creates a creation for human society to operate within. If you don't understand how human society works, there is little chance that your constitution will work out for the best. But to end on a cheerful note regarding changing constitutions, those of us who would change the UK constitution are in a very happy position. Under the unwritten constitutional arrangements in Britain, it is as easy to change the constitution as it is to make new legislation. UK governments take advantage of this all the time. Blair's creation of a Supreme Court is an obvious example. To an American or a Frenchman, the idea that Parliament could effect such a far-reaching constitutional change is incomprehensible. A few years back, the Conservative Lib Dem coalition introduced fixed-term parliaments for the first time in our history. I am not sure what happened to that, but as the UK constitution is so fluid, it may well have been dropped. This laughable weakness in the UK means that installing a completely new constitution would be easier here than in any other country. All we need is a majority in the Commons and a not too antagonistic Lords, and we can pass through a new constitution. Of course, we include provisions for changing the new constitution that would be quite onerous according to normal sound constitutional principles. So even if we lost the next election, the constitution could not be reversed. In no other country can the revolution be accomplished in such a straightforward manner. There is every reason why Britain must be in the vanguard of the new era.